Welcome to Pharmoon Drops. In this playlist of Pharmoon, the questions asked in various competitive exams are discussed. The answers, along with a brief description, question and answer, are discussed as a point, followed by description on the related points. First question and answer is the analysis of biological fluids for sodium, potassium, calcium ions can be done using flame photometry. Flame photometry can be used for the analysis of metal ions like sodium, potassium, and calcium. Flame photometry is also known as flame emission spectroscopy. When a solution containing metal is introduced into a flame, vaporization happens, and the metal ions present in the vapor are excited to a higher energy level. When a metal solution is exposed to a flame, vaporization happens, and the atoms present in the vapor are excited to a higher energy level. The excited metal atoms can emit radiation. The excited metal atoms can emit radiation. That radiation is a characteristic feature of that metal. That radiation is a characteristic feature of that metal. From the wavelength of the emitted radiation, the metal can be identified. From the wavelength of the emitted radiation, the metal can be identified. From the intensity of the emitted radiation, the quantity of metal can be detected. From the intensity of the emitted radiation, the quantity of metal can be detected. Two equations behind the theory of flame emission spectroscopy are Bohr's equation and Boltzmann's equation. Two equations behind the theory of flame emission spectroscopy are Bohr's equation and Boltzmann's equation. Now, about the instrumentation of flame emission spectroscopy. Two types of equipments are used. First one is simple flame photometer, and the second one is internal standard flame photometer. Two types of flame emission spectrophotometers are simple flame photometer and internal standard flame photometer. The general instrumentation of flame emission spectroscopy contains the following parts: the sample container, a nebulizer and atomizer, a mixing chamber for the atomized sample, compressed air, and fuel gas. From this area, this mixture is passed through a flame. After the flame, there will be a optical filter. This filter allow the passage of the strongest radiation line of the metal. This optical filter out the other weak optical rays. After the optical filter, there comes a photocell. These photocells convert the light energy to electrical energy. After the photocell, a amplifier is placed which amplify the weak electrical signal. These electrical signals are then measured on a digital readout device. First comes the sample container, then the nebulizer and atomizer, then the mixing chamber, then the flame, then the optical filter, then the photocell, then the amplifier, then the readout device. Now let's see the difference between simple flame photometer and internal standard flame photometer. In simple flame photometer, just after the flame, you can see a concave lens. In simple flame photometer, just after the flame, you can see a concave lens. In the internal standard flame photometer, you can see a mirror after the optical filter. In the internal standard flame photometer, we can see a mirror after the optical filter. The purpose of the mirror is to separate the optical lines coming from the internal standard and the element under examination. The mirror is used to separate the optical lines coming from the internal standard and the element under examination. Internal standard used in this method is lithium. That is, in internal standard flame photometers, lithium is used as a standard, which means the sample solution contains lithium as an internal standard, which means along with the metal under examination, internal standard is added. The detecting device used in internal standard flame photometers are null detectors. Null detectors are used in internal standard flame photometers. These detectors can detect the intensity of light coming from the element under examination and the internal standard lithium. These detectors, that is null detectors, can detect the intensity of light coming from the element under examination and the internal standard lithium. The flame emission spectroscopy is used for assaying sodium, potassium and calcium in blood serum and water to detect the quantity of sodium, potassium and calcium in blood sample and in water. We can use flame emission spectrophotometry. It can also be used for the assay of barium. Flame emission spectroscopy is also used for the assay of barium. Next question in Pharmoon drops is vitamin K is necessary for The formation of prothrombin. Vitamin K is necessary for the formation of prothrombin. Prothrombin is coagulation factor number 2. Prothrombin is coagulation factor number 2. Let's see the names of other clotting factors in the description part of this question. Factor number 1 is fibrinogen. You can remember this by remembering a word no one. No is for fibrinogen. 1 is for factor number 1. The term fibrinogen contains no and you add this with 1. You get no one. From no one you remember that fibrinogen is factor number 1. Factor number 2 is prothrombin. You can remember this by remembering a sentence, throw to the bin. Here, throw and bin is for prothrombin. In between throw and bin, you can see a word to, that is throw to the bin. That 2 indicates it's factor number 2. You remember throw to the bin. Throw plus bin is for prothrombin. 2 is for factor number 2. Factor number 3 is thromboplastin. You remember this by 3-throw combination. 3 is for factor number 3. Throw is for thromboplastin. An alternative name for thromboplastin is tissue factor. That name also starts with the letter T. Factor number 4 is calcium. Calcium starts with Ca. You can convert this to car. And remember, car has 4 wheels. From this, you can remember that calcium is the 4th factor. 5th factor is proaxillerin. In the 4th factor, we have seen car. 5th factor is related to a part of car, that is accelerator. From accelerator, you can remember proaxillerin. Proaxillerin is also known as labile factor. 6th factor does not have a name. To remember this, you can remember a sentence that 6th factor is a silly one. Or in short, 6th is silly. That means no name. 7th factor is stable factor. Stable factor is otherwise known as proconvertin. You remember this by a sentence. 7th floor is converted into a stable floor. 7th floor indicates 7th factor. Converted indicates proconvertin into a stable floor indicates stable factor. 8th factor is antihemophilic factor. 7th factor is related to 7th stable floor and the 8th factor is related to Andy's home. 8th factor is antihemophilic factor. You can remember this by remembering the word Andy's home. Anti-home can be modified into antihemophilic factor, which is the 8th one. 9th factor is Christmas factor. You can remember this with Christmas night. The word night starts with NI. and the word 9 starts with NI. From the word Christmas night, you can remember that Christmas factor is the ninth factor. 10th factor is Stuart Prower factor. You can remember this with student in 10th standard. The word student starts with STU. The word steward also starts with STU. Student in 10th standard. From the word student, you remember Stuart Prower factor. In the 10th standard indicates it's the 10th factor. Students in the 10th standard will be having PTA meeting. PTA means Parent Teachers Association meeting. This PTA stands for plasma thromboplastin antecedent. In short, PTA, which is the 11th factor. 10th factor can be remembered with the word student in the 10th standard. Afterwards, you remember that student will be having PTA meeting. From PTA, you remember plasma thromboplastin antecedent. That is the 11th factor. 11th is very next to 10. You correlate these two. 12th factor is Hageman factor. There is a film, namely 12th Man. From this movie name, you can remember that 12th factor contains a word man. 12th man indicates 12th factor is Hageman factor. And the last factor is 13th factor, namely fibrin stabilizing factor. 13th factor is the final factor. The final factor starts with Fi, final fibrin. Both look similar. Final factor is fibrin stabilizing factor. You can remember one more thing also. First factor and final factor start with Fi. The words first and final start with Fi. Similarly, first factor fibrinogen starts with Fi and final factor, that is 13th factor, also starts with Fi, means fibrin stabilizing factor. Fibrin stabilizing factor is also known as transglutaminase. Thank you for listening to Pharmoon.